Storm's supposed to get worse before it gets better. Kitchen's closing soon, but I can get you something quick. On the house if you're just passing through and things are tight.
I couldn't ask you to do that.
Just a little extra gravy. Order up, meatloaf and potatoes.
I think you'd be needing this. Might as well go somewhere useful. Rough night out there. I'll make sure you get home safe. Y'all say that every time it storms and every time you still order the pie.
The rain came down hard on Route 9 outside Millbrook Falls, Tennessee. The kind of rain that turns a two-lane highway into a river of headlights and fear. Inside a battered gray pickup truck with no company logo, no bodyguards, and no driver waiting outside, sat a man worth $11 billion. And for the first time in 30 years, nobody on Earth knew where he was. His name was Nathaniel Cole, and 3 days earlier he had walked out of the top floor of Coleridge Tower in Atlanta wearing a $2,000 suit, and he had not been seen since. Tonight he wore a torn flannel jacket that smelled like a thrift store, and his hands that had signed billion-dollar mergers, were shaking on the wheel of a truck that kept sputtering every time it hit 50 miles an hour. He pulled into the gravel lot of a diner called the Blue Willow, its neon sign flickering pink against the storm, and he sat there for a long moment just staring at the light through the rain-streaked windshield, wondering if he had finally lost his mind. But he needed to know something, and no accountant, no assistant, no boardroom full of lawyers could ever tell him the truth he was chasing. He needed to know if there was still a single soul left on this earth who would be kind to a stranger who had nothing to offer them in return. So he pushed open the truck door, stepped into the storm, and walked toward the only light for miles. Inside the Blue Willow, a 29-year-old waitress named Grace Whitfield was wiping down the counter for the 11th time that night, not because it needed it, but because her hands needed something to do besides shake. She had gotten the phone call from the hospital 40 minutes earlier, the one that told her that her 6-year-old son Tommy's kidney treatment would cost $18,000 that insurance would not cover, and that the window to start it before real damage set in was closing fast. Grace had $11 in her apron, and a smile that had learned, over years of practice, how to hide absolutely everything. When the bell over the door jingled, and a soaked, shivering stranger stumbled in, looking like he hadn't eaten in days, she did not see a threat, and she did not see a burden. She saw a man who needed a hot cup of coffee and a place to sit down, and so that is exactly what she gave him. That single choice, made by an exhausted woman with almost nothing left to give, was about to collide with the secret plans of a dying empire, a scheming nephew already dividing up $11 billion in his mind, and a truth buried for 30 years that would tear two families apart before it could ever heal them. If you have ever wondered whether kindness still means something in a world obsessed with money, stay with this story until the end. Because what happened in that diner over the following 7 days did not just change one billionaire's life. It changed everyone who thought they already knew who he was. Before we go further, if stories about real kindness, hidden identities, and families finding their way back to each other speak to you, hit that subscribe button now, because there is a moment coming in this story that changes everything, and you will not want to miss what happens right after it. Nathaniel Cole slid onto a cracked vinyl stool at the counter, and Grace set a chipped white mug in front of him without being asked, filling it to the brim with coffee that had been sitting on the burner for 2 hours and tasted like it. Storm's supposed to get worse before it gets better, she said, sliding a laminated menu toward him, though she had already clocked the way his eyes moved across the prices like a man doing math he couldn't afford to lose. Kitchen's closing soon, but I can get you something quick. On the house, if you're just passing through and things are tight. Nathaniel looked up at her, startled, because in 30 years of business dinners and charity galas, no one had ever offered him something for nothing without wanting a photograph or a favor in return. I couldn't ask you to do that, he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended, cracked from 3 days of barely speaking to anyone. Grace just shrugged and disappeared into the kitchen, returning minutes later with a plate of meatloaf and mashed potatoes that the cook, a heavy-set man named Earl who had worked there for 22 years, had been about to throw out at closing anyway. It was going in the trash regardless. Grace lied smoothly, setting the plate down. Might as well go somewhere useful. Nathaniel ate like a man who hadn't tasted real food in years, though the truth was, he had eaten at a 5-star restaurant in Charleston only 4 days earlier and hadn't been able to finish a single bite because grief does strange things to a man's appetite, and grief was the reason he was sitting in this diner at all. He watched Grace work for the next hour as the storm rattled the windows, watched her comfort an elderly man named Walter Higgins, who came in every night just to have somewhere warm to sit since his wife had passed. Watched her slip a to-go box of pie to a teenage boy who clearly hadn't eaten since breakfast and clearly had no money to pay for it. Watched her laugh with regular customers, even though he could see, in the tight lines around her eyes, that something was breaking her apart inside. When her shift ended near midnight, Nathaniel asked the question that would change everything. Is there any work around here? Anything at all? I'm not looking for charity. I just need something. Grace studied him for a long moment. This stranger with expensive bone structure and a cheap jacket. Something about him not quite adding up. And then she said the words that no one had said to him in longer than he could remember. My grandmother's ranch needs help. It doesn't pay much, but it's honest work, and there's a bed in the barn loft that's dry. Come by tomorrow morning if you mean it. Nathaniel Cole, who owned 4 private jets and a controlling stake in one of the largest logistics empires in North America, lay awake that night in the cab of his broken-down truck, staring at the ceiling, feeling something he hadn't felt in 15 years. Hope, and he had absolutely no idea that the woman who had just offered him a job mucking out stalls was about to become the reason his entire empire and his entire family would be forced into the light. The Whitfield Ranch sat on 40 acres at the edge of town, land that had been in Grace's family for 4 generations, though only 12 of those acres were still worked. The rest sold off piece by piece over the years to keep the lights on. Grace's grandmother, Ruth Whitfield, 78 years old, with hands like leather and a spine that had never once bent to anyone, met Nathaniel at the gate the next morning with a shotgun that she made very clear she knew how to use. Grace says you need work, Ruth said, looking him over the way a rancher looks over a horse, before deciding whether to buy it. I don't pay in cash most weeks. I pay in food, a roof, and honest labor for honest labor. You steal from me, you disrespect my granddaughter, or you so much as raise your voice at my great-grandson, you'll be gone before you know what hit you. We clear? Nathaniel, who had not been spoken to that way since his own father died 3 decades earlier, found himself fighting back an unexpected smile. Crystal clear, ma'am, he said, and meant it more than he had meant anything in years. That first day, Nathaniel Cole, who had never once in his adult life shoveled anything heavier than paperwork, spent 6 hours mucking out a barn, mending fence posts with hands that blistered within the hour, and hauling feed sacks that left his back screaming by sundown. He was, by any objective measure, terrible at every task Ruth gave him. But he did not quit, and he did not complain. And when 6-year-old Tommy Whitfield came running out of the farmhouse that evening with a plastic dinosaur in his fist, demanding that the new ranch hand play with him, Nathaniel got down on his knees in the mud without a moment's hesitation and let the boy win an epic battle between a Triceratops and a very poorly executed Tyrannosaurus Rex. From the porch, Grace watched this stranger laugh, really laugh, for the first time since he'd arrived, and something in her chest that had been clenched tight for months finally loosened just a little. Over dinner that night, a simple meal of cornbread and stew that Nathaniel found more satisfying than any tasting menu he'd ever paid $400 for, he learned pieces of the Whitfield family's story. Grace's husband, a Marine named Daniel, had been killed in a training accident 3 years earlier, leaving her alone with Tommy and a mountain of grief she rarely let anyone see. She worked double shifts at the diner and cleaned houses on weekends, and still it was barely enough, and now Tommy's kidneys were failing in a slow, cruel way that no 6-year-old should ever have to understand, and the treatment that could save him cost more than Grace would earn in 2 years of double shifts combined. She told Nathaniel none of the financial specifics that night, because pride ran as deep in the Whitfield family as the Tennessee red clay beneath their land. But he saw it in the way she counted out Tommy's medication into a pill organizer with the exact, careful precision of a woman who could not afford to waste a single dose. That night, lying in the dry, hay-scented dark of the barn loft, Nathaniel Cole pulled out a satellite phone he had hidden in the lining of his duffel bag, the only piece of his old life he'd allowed himself to bring. He dialed a number he knew by heart. "Diane," he said quietly, when his executive assistant picked up on the second ring, her voice thick with 3 days of worry. "I need you to find out everything you can about a boy named Tommy Whitfield, 6 years old, kidney condition, in Millbrook Falls, Tennessee. Do it quietly. Do it tonight." Diane Marsh had worked for Nathaniel Cole for 11 years, and in all that time she had never once heard that particular tone in his voice, a tone that sounded less like a billionaire giving an order, and more like a man who had just found something he thought he'd lost forever. "Nathaniel," she said carefully, "your board is asking questions. Marcus has called an emergency session for Thursday. If you're not back by then..." He cut her off. "Thursday is 4 days away. That's enough time to find out who I'm really looking for." He hung up before she could argue, but what neither of them knew yet was that Marcus Cole, Nathaniel's 34-year-old nephew and the company's chief financial officer, was not simply trying to protect the business in his uncle's absence. He was trying to make sure his uncle never came back to run it at all. 300 miles away, in a glass-walled office on the 40th floor of Coleridge Tower, Marcus Cole stood at the window with a phone pressed to his ear, watching the Atlanta skyline glitter beneath him like something he already owned. "He's gone off the grid completely," Marcus said to the voice on the other end, a voice belonging to a lawyer named Preston Hale, who had been quietly drafting incompetency papers for the past 6 weeks. No security detail, no assistant with him, nothing. "If he doesn't surface by the board meeting, we call it what it is. A man in the grip of a breakdown after his wife's death is not fit to run a company this size." Preston's voice crackled back, cautious but eager. "You understand, once we file this, there's no undoing it." "If he comes back and finds out," Marcus cut him off with a short, cold laugh. "He's not going to find out anything. He's going to come crawling back from wherever he's hiding, and the board is going to see a man who abandoned an $11 billion company to disappear for a week without a word." "I've been waiting 15 years for this seat, Preston. I'm not waiting 1 day longer." What Marcus did not know, what no one in that glass tower knew, was that his uncle had disappeared, not out of a breakdown, but out of a promise. 6 months earlier, on her deathbed, Nathaniel's wife Eleanor had gripped his hand with the last of her strength and made him swear something that had haunted him every day since. "You built all of this," she had whispered, "and I watched it hollow you out 1 year at a time. Promise me, Nate. Before you die, find one person who is kind to you for no reason at all. Find out if the world you built is worth what it cost us." Eleanor Cole had died 4 hours later, and Nathaniel had spent 6 months trying to work up the courage to keep that promise. Until finally, 3 days ago, he had simply walked out of his own life to go looking for an answer. By the 3rd day at the Whitfield Ranch, Nathaniel Cole had learned to mend fences, milk the 2 remaining dairy cows without getting kicked, and lose gracefully at checkers to a 6-year-old who cheated shamelessly and adorably. He had also learned that Ruth Whitfield had a heart condition she was hiding from her granddaughter, that Grace hadn't bought herself a single new item of clothing in over 2 years, and that the ranch itself was 6 weeks behind on a property tax bill that, if unpaid, would let the county seize the land the Whitfields had held for over 100 years. He learned all of this not because anyone told him directly, but because he had spent 30 years learning to read financial desperation in the smallest details. And the Whitfield family wore theirs quietly, with dignity, and without a single word of complaint. It was on the fourth night, during a thunderstorm that knocked the power out across half the county, that everything nearly fell apart. Grace came home from a double shift to find Tommy burning with a fever of 104, his small body shaking, his lips tinged faintly blue, a sign she recognized with pure terror as his kidneys beginning to fail in earnest. There was no time to wait for an ambulance that might take 40 minutes on flooded roads. Nathaniel, without a second's hesitation, scooped the boy into his arms, carried him to the truck, and drove through the storm at speeds that would have terrified him in any other circumstance, weaving around fallen branches and flooded intersections, while Grace sat in the back seat holding her son and praying out loud in a voice raw with panic. When they burst through the doors of Millbrook Falls Memorial Hospital, Nathaniel didn't think, didn't calculate, didn't remember for one single second that he was supposed to be a poor drifter with no resources at all. He simply looked at the nurse behind the desk and said the words that would begin unraveling everything. "Whatever this boy needs, I will make sure it is paid for. Do not wait on insurance. Treat him now." The nurse, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia who had worked in that ER for 20 years, looked at this disheveled, mud-streaked stranger, making promises no drifter could possibly keep, and something about the absolute certainty in his voice made her pause. But there was no time to question it, because Tommy needed to be in a treatment room immediately, and so the moment dissolved into the organized chaos of an emergency room fighting to save a little boy's life. Grace, standing in the hallway with her hands pressed over her mouth, turned to look at Nathaniel with an expression caught somewhere between gratitude and confusion. "What did you mean, you'll make sure it's paid for?" she asked quietly, her voice shaking. "You don't have any money. You've been sleeping in my grandmother's barn." Nathaniel opened his mouth, and for the first time in 7 days, he had absolutely no idea what to say. If this story has your heart racing already, imagine what's still ahead, because the truth Nathaniel is about to reveal is only the first secret of many, and not even the most dangerous one. Stay with us. He was saved from answering by Dr. Amara Okafor, the young pediatric specialist who emerged from the treatment room 40 minutes later with the kind of careful, measured expression doctors wear when the news isn't good, but isn't the worst it could be either. "We've stabilized him for now," she said, and Grace's knees nearly buckled with relief. "But Mrs. Whitfield, I have to be honest with you. Tommy's kidney function has declined significantly since his last screening. He needs to begin the treatment protocol we discussed, and he needs to begin it this week, not next month. I know insurance has been difficult, but I cannot stress enough how urgent this has become." Grace nodded, tears streaming silently down her face, because she already knew the number. $18,000 she did not have and could not raise in a week, even if she sold every single thing she owned, including the truck her husband had left behind. Nathaniel stood in that hospital corridor and watched a mother's entire world crack open in real time, and he understood, with a clarity that hit him like a physical blow, exactly why Eleanor had sent him on this journey. He had $11 billion sitting in accounts across 4 continents, and $18,000 was less than what he had spent on a single dinner party the month before his wife died. And yet this woman, this fiercely proud, endlessly kind woman, who had fed a stranger for free and given him a roof over his head, was standing in a hospital hallway with nothing left to offer her own son except her tears. He excused himself, walked out into the parking lot in the pouring rain, and made a phone call that would set an unstoppable chain of events into motion. "Diane," he said, his voice shaking with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in months, "I need $18,000 transferred to Millbrook Falls Memorial Hospital by morning, under the name Tommy Whitfield, and I need it to look like it came from a charitable foundation, not from me. Can you do that without anyone tracing it back?" Diane, who had spent 3 sleepless days fielding calls from a panicking board of directors, felt something in her chest ease for the first time all week. "Nathaniel, thank God. Yes, I can route it through the Eleanor Cole Memorial Fund. No one will ask questions about a small medical grant. But you need to tell me what's going on. Marcus is circling like a shark, and the board meets in 3 days. Nathaniel closed his eyes, rain running down his face, and for a moment he almost told her everything. Instead, he said only, 3 days is enough time. Just get me the transfer, and tell no one where I am. Not yet. What Nathaniel did not know was that Preston Hale's law firm had already quietly subpoenaed the Coleridge Foundation's recent transaction records as part of the incompetency filing, searching for any evidence of erratic or irresponsible spending they could use against him. An $18,000 anonymous medical grant to a small-town Tennessee hospital, appearing out of nowhere during the exact week the CEO had vanished, was about to become the very first thread that Marcus Cole's legal team would pull, a thread that would eventually unravel far more than either of them expected. By morning, the hospital's billing office informed a stunned and disbelieving Grace that Tommy's entire treatment protocol had been covered in full by an anonymous charitable grant. Grace sat in the hospital cafeteria staring at the paperwork, reading it 3 times over, convinced there had to be some mistake, some other family this belonged to. When she finally found Nathaniel in the waiting room, exhausted and unshaven, still wearing yesterday's mud-streaked clothes, she grabbed his arm with a fierce, searching grip. "Did you do this?" she demanded. "Nathaniel, tell me the truth. How does a man with no job and no money make $18,000 appear overnight?" And Nathaniel Cole, staring into the eyes of the woman who had shown him more genuine kindness in 4 days than most of his own family had shown him in a decade, made a choice that would change the course of everything that followed. He lied. "I called in an old favor," he said quietly, unable yet to meet her eyes fully. "Someone I used to know owed me something. It's not important who. What matters is that Tommy is going to get better." Grace studied him for a long moment, torn between overwhelming gratitude and a nagging unease that something did not add up, but exhaustion and relief won out over suspicion, and she pulled him into a hug so sudden and so fierce that Nathaniel Cole, a man who had shaken hands with senators and dined with presidents, found himself fighting back tears in a hospital waiting room at 6 in the morning. "Whoever you really are," Grace whispered against his shoulder, "thank you. I don't know how to repay this." Nathaniel closed his eyes and thought, with a mixture of guilt and wonder, that she had already repaid him 1,000 times over, and she didn't even know it yet. But secrets have a way of surfacing at the worst possible moment, and back in Atlanta, Marcus Cole had just found the exact opening he needed. The board meeting was moved up to the next morning, an emergency session called by Marcus under the justification that Coleridge Industries could not continue operating without clarity on its leadership. 12 board members filed into the walnut-paneled conference room on the 40th floor, uneasy murmurs filling the space as Marcus stood at the head of the table in a tailored charcoal suit, projecting calm authority he had spent 15 years perfecting. "I don't take pleasure in this," he began, his voice smooth and practiced, "but my uncle has been missing for 6 days. No communication with this board, no communication with senior leadership, and now we have evidence." He clicked to a slide showing the anonymous $18,000 transfer of erratic, untraceable spending from a foundation he controls personally, routed to an unknown recipient in rural Tennessee. "I love my uncle, but I have a fiduciary responsibility to this company, and I believe we are looking at a man in the grip of a serious mental health crisis following Aunt Eleanor's death." A silence fell over the room, broken only when Diane Marsh, sitting in the corner as she always did during board meetings, spoke up with a steadiness that surprised even herself. "With respect, Marcus, spending your own foundation's money on a medical grant for a sick child is not evidence of incompetence. It's evidence of generosity. And I would remind this board that Nathaniel Cole built this company from a single trucking route in 1994 into an $11 billion logistics empire, and he has never once, in 30 years, missed a quarterly earnings call by accident. If he's gone dark, I would suggest that's a decision, not a breakdown." Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a flash of irritation crossing his face before the practiced calm slid back into place. "Diane, your loyalty is admirable, but loyalty isn't a legal defense. I've asked Preston Hale to prepare a formal petition for temporary incapacity, effective immediately, naming me as interim CEO until my uncle can be located and evaluated. The room erupted into a storm of objections and questions, and Diane, watching Marcus's carefully constructed performance, understood with a sinking certainty that this had never been about Nathaniel's well-being at all. That afternoon, unaware that his own company was preparing to legally remove him from power, Nathaniel Cole was back at the Whitfield Ranch, splitting firewood with Ruth's ancient axe, when Grace approached him with an envelope in her hands and an expression he hadn't seen on her before, something guarded and searching. "I need to ask you something," she said, sitting down on an overturned bucket across from him. "And I need you to be honest with me, because I have been honest with you since the night you walked into my diner." Nathaniel set down the axe, his heart suddenly pounding, because he could see in her eyes that something had shifted. "There's a man who came into the diner today," Grace continued, asking questions. "Sharp suit, city car, said he was looking for information about a drifter matching your description who'd been seen around Millbrook Falls. Nathaniel, who are you really? And don't tell me you called in an old favor, because I called the number on that hospital paperwork this morning out of curiosity, and it traced back to something called the Eleanor Cole Memorial Fund." Eleanor Cole. That's not a coincidence, is it? The rain had stopped, but the air between them felt heavier than any storm, and Nathaniel Cole understood that the moment he had been avoiding for 6 days had finally, unavoidably, arrived. He told her everything. He told her his real name and watched the color drain slowly from her face as recognition dawned, because even in a small Tennessee town, people knew the name Coleridge Industries, knew it from the trucks that rumbled through on the interstate, knew it from news stories about billionaires and mergers that felt like they belonged to a different universe entirely. He told her about Eleanor, about the promise made in a hospital room 6 months earlier, about a man who had built an empire and lost himself somewhere in the process, and about a desperate, half-mad idea to disappear for a week and find out if there was still a single person left who would be kind to him for absolutely nothing in return. "I never meant to lie to you," he said, his voice breaking. "I meant to tell you the truth the moment it stopped mattering to the experiment, but then Tommy got sick, and I couldn't watch you suffer for one more day just to prove some point about human nature. So I made a call, and I paid for his treatment, and I know that makes me a liar and possibly the worst kind of manipulator, and I understand if you never want to see me again." Grace sat very still for a long moment, staring at the man she had fed, sheltered, and trusted, a man who was, impossibly, worth more money than she could conceive of, and she felt something complicated twist inside her. Betrayal wrestling against gratitude, anger wrestling against the plain fact that this man had saved her son's life without asking for anything at all. "You let me think you had nothing," she finally said, quiet and shaking. "You let my grandmother threaten you with a shotgun. You slept in a barn. You let Tommy believe you were just some ranch hand who liked dinosaurs. Did any of it mean anything, or was I just part of some rich man's science experiment?" Nathaniel reached for her hand, and though she flinched, she did not pull away. "It meant everything," he said. "It was the first honest week of my life in 15 years. The lie was never about you, Grace. It was about me trying to become a man worth the kindness you'd already given me." Before Grace could respond, a car engine sounded from the long gravel driveway, and both of them turned to see a black sedan pulling up to the ranch house, a car that clearly did not belong on a road built for pickup trucks and tractors. 2 men in dark suits stepped out, and Nathaniel felt his stomach drop, because he recognized one of them immediately. It was Preston Hale, his own family's lawyer, and he was holding a manila folder that Nathaniel understood, with sudden dawning horror, contained legal papers that could take away everything he'd spent 30 years building. "Mr. Cole," Preston called out across the yard, his voice carrying the practiced professional coldness of a man who had done this kind of thing before. "I'm glad we finally located you. I'm afraid I have some documents that require your immediate attention, and a car waiting to take you back to Atlanta." Ruth Whitfield stepped out onto the porch at that exact moment, shotgun once again cradled in the crook of her arm, and looked between the strange men in suits and the ranch hand she'd taken in 6 days earlier with an expression of pure, dawning fury. "Somebody better start explaining what in God's name is going on in my front yard," she said, and her voice cracked across the yard like a whip. "You will not believe what happens when Nathaniel finally faces his own family. Make sure you're subscribed, because the second half of this story is where everything changes." Preston Hale walked across the yard with the folder held out like a weapon, and Nathaniel, feeling Grace's eyes burning into the side of his face, opened it to find exactly what he feared. A petition, already filed with a Fulton County judge, requesting an emergency hearing to determine his mental competency, supported by affidavits from 3 board members, and, most damning of all, a psychiatric evaluation request based on what the document called a documented pattern of erratic behavior, unexplained disappearance, and irresponsible financial transactions, inconsistent with sound judgment. Nathaniel read it twice, his hands shaking with a fury he hadn't felt since his father's funeral, and looked up at Preston with cold, dangerous clarity. "Marcus filed this," he said. It wasn't a question. "Your nephew has been acting in what he believes is the best interest of the company," Preston said carefully, choosing each word like he was walking across broken glass. "Given your extended absence and lack of communication." Nathaniel let out a short, bitter laugh. "My extended absence was 6 days, Preston. 6 days after burying my wife of 31 years. And instead of picking up a phone to check if I was alive, my nephew filed papers to have me declared incompetent so he could steal the company I built from nothing." Grace, standing beside him, felt the ground shift beneath everything she thought she understood about this man, watching him transform in real time from the gentle, awkward ranch hand who lost at checkers into someone sharper, colder, and entirely capable of the empire he apparently controlled. "There's something else," Preston said, and something in his tone made Nathaniel go very still. "The petition includes financial records, specifically an $18,000 transfer from the Eleanor Cole Memorial Fund, made 2 days ago, to Millbrook Falls Memorial Hospital for the treatment of a minor named Thomas Whitfield." Preston's eyes flicked deliberately toward Grace, and toward the boy now visible through the screen door of the farmhouse, watching the strange scene in the yard with wide, frightened eyes. "The filing suggests this transfer represents an unusual attachment to persons unrelated to the company, consistent with, and I'm quoting the filing directly, diminished capacity following a significant personal loss." Nathaniel felt something cold settle in his chest as the full shape of Marcus's plan came into focus. His nephew wasn't just trying to remove him from the company, he was trying to use Tommy, an innocent 6-year-old boy, as evidence that Nathaniel Cole had lost his mind. Grace stepped forward then, her voice shaking with a fury that surprised even her. "You listen to me," she said, jabbing a finger toward Preston Hale hard enough that he actually took a step back. "That money saved my son's life. If that makes a man mentally incompetent in the eyes of the law, then this country has lost its damn mind, not him. You tell whoever sent you that if they think using a sick child to steal a company makes them clever, they've got another thing coming, because I will testify in front of every judge in Georgia about exactly what kind of man Nathaniel Cole is, and it is not the kind of man your filing describes." Ruth, still cradling her shotgun on the porch, called out with grim satisfaction, "That's my granddaughter. Now get off my land before I decide the shotgun's for more than just show." Preston, visibly rattled but professionally unwilling to back down entirely, informed Nathaniel that the competency hearing had been scheduled for 4 days out, and that his continued absence would only strengthen the petition's claims. As the black sedan pulled away down the gravel drive, Nathaniel Cole stood in the yard of the Whitfield Ranch feeling, for the first time in his adult life, truly and completely afraid, not of losing his fortune, but of losing the one thing that fortune had never been able to buy him back. His own family's trust, and worse, the trust of the woman standing beside him, whose eyes were now fixed on him with a question he wasn't sure he could answer honestly. "Are you going to go back?" Grace asked quietly. "Are you going to fight them?" Nathaniel turned to look at her, at Tommy's small, frightened face still pressed against the screen door, at Ruth standing guard on the porch like a soldier who had never once retreated from a fight in her life, and he felt the last 6 days settle into something with real weight and real purpose. "I came here to find out if I was still capable of being a good man," he said slowly. I think I finally have my answer, but now I need to go back and prove it. In a courtroom, in front of the very people trying to convince the world I'm not fit to run my own life. And Grace, I need to ask you something, and I understand completely if the answer is no. Will you come with me? Not because I need a witness for the hearing, though God knows I do, but because these past 6 days were the realest thing that's happened to me in 15 years, and I don't think I can walk back into that world alone. The Fulton County Courthouse rose 11 stories above downtown Atlanta, its marble steps crowded with reporters the morning Nathaniel Cole's competency hearing began, because word had leaked, as it always does in cases involving billion-dollar companies, and cameras jostled for position as Nathaniel walked up those steps in a suit for the first time in over a week, Grace beside him in a simple navy dress she'd borrowed from a friend, Tommy safely back in Tennessee with Ruth, and Diane Marsh walking a half step behind them with a leather folder clutched tight against her chest like a shield. Inside the courtroom, Marcus Cole sat at the petitioner's table beside Preston Hale, dressed in a suit that cost more than most of Millbrook Falls made in a month, his face arranged into an expression of practiced, sorrowful concern that made Grace's stomach turn the moment she saw it. Judge Eleanor Vasquez, a stern woman in her 60s, who had presided over Fulton County's civil docket for 18 years and had absolutely no patience for theatrics, called the hearing to order and made clear from the outset that she intended to move through the evidence methodically and without sentiment. Preston Hale opened by walking the court through 6 days of unexplained absence, unreachable phone lines, and what he characterized as a pattern of behavior beginning immediately after Eleanor Cole's funeral. Behavior he argued was consistent with acute grief-induced psychosis, or at minimum, judgment so compromised that Nathaniel Cole could no longer be trusted with the daily operational decisions of an $11 billion company. He called forward a psychiatrist, Dr. Reginald Sloan, who had never once met or examined Nathaniel Cole in person, but who testified based on second-hand behavioral reports that the pattern described was, in his professional opinion, consistent with a dissociative break from reality following profound loss. Grace sat in the gallery watching this parade of strangers describe a man she had come to know as gentle, thoughtful, and endlessly patient with a 6-year-old's dinosaur battles. A man who blistered his hands mending fences without a single complaint, being systematically reconstructed in front of a judge as unstable and dangerous to his own interests. And she felt a rage building in her chest that had nowhere to go until Nathaniel's attorney, a sharp, silver-haired woman named Corinne Ashby, whom Diane had retained the moment they returned to Atlanta, rose and called her first witness. The defense calls Grace Whitfield. Every head in the courtroom turned as Grace walked to the witness stand, and she felt Marcus Cole's eyes on her the entire way, cold and calculating, sizing her up as a variable he hadn't accounted for. Corinne Ashby approached with a calm, deliberate warmth. Mrs. Whitfield, can you tell the court how you first encountered Nathaniel Cole? Grace took a breath, steadied her voice, and told the truth exactly as it happened. The storm, the diner, the offer of a hot meal to a stranger who looked like he hadn't eaten in days, the shotgun-guarded job offer at her grandmother's ranch, and 6 days of watching a man work harder than anyone she'd ever met, laugh with her son over a plastic dinosaur, and carry a burning, feverish 6-year-old through a flooded storm to save his life. He never once asked for anything, Grace said, her voice growing steadier and stronger with every sentence. He mended fences until his hands bled. He listened when my grandmother threatened him with a shotgun, and he called her ma'am and meant it with respect, not fear. And when my son's kidneys started failing in the middle of a thunderstorm, he didn't hesitate for 1 single second. That is not a broken man, Your Honor. That is the sanest, most decent man I have met in 3 years. And I have known plenty of people who talked a lot louder about their own decency. Marcus's attorney rose for cross-examination, attempting to paint Grace's testimony as the grateful bias of a woman who had received $18,000 in medical assistance from the very man she was defending, but Grace held her ground with a steadiness that visibly unsettled him. And by the time she stepped down from the stand, something in the room had shifted, a current of doubt now running through the courtroom, and even Judge Vasquez's carefully neutral expression had softened almost imperceptibly. But Corinne Ashby was not finished, and what she revealed next would blow the entire hearing wide open. "Your Honor," Corinne said, rising with a second folder in hand, "the defense has recently obtained financial records through subpoena that we believe are directly relevant to the petitioner's true motivations in filing this action." Marcus went pale, the first genuine crack in his composed mask all morning. "These records," Corinne continued, "show that Marcus Cole, in his role as Chief Financial Officer, authorized the transfer of $42 million from a Coleridge Industries subsidiary account into a shell entity registered in the Cayman Islands 11 days ago, 1 day before Eleanor Cole's funeral, and 3 days before this competency petition was drafted." A wave of murmurs rippled through the gallery, and Judge Vasquez leaned forward sharply. "Continue, Counselor." Corinne did, laying out records showing that the shell entity, registered under an obscure holding company name, traced back through 2 additional layers of ownership, directly to Preston Hale's own law firm, and further, to a private account controlled by Marcus Cole personally. Marcus shot to his feet, his composure finally cracking entirely. "Your Honor, this is completely irrelevant to the matter of my uncle's competency, and frankly, it's a desperate attempt to distract from—" Judge Vasquez cut him off with a single raised hand. "Mr. Cole, a $42 million transfer to a shell company controlled by your own family, timed 1 day before your aunt's funeral, and days before you filed to seize control of the company, is very much relevant to this court's understanding of your motivations. Sit down." Diane Marsh, watching from the gallery, finally allowed herself a small, grim smile, because she had spent the last 4 days quietly digging through records, precisely because something about Marcus's sudden urgency had never sat right with her, and now the truth was finally surfacing in front of a judge who had the power to do something about it. If you thought that was the twist, you have no idea what's coming. Comment below and tell us what you think Marcus was really planning, because the truth is even worse than embezzlement. Judge Vasquez called a recess to review the newly submitted financial records, and during that recess, in a marble hallway outside the courtroom, Nathaniel finally confronted his nephew face to face for the first time in over a week. Marcus, stripped of his practiced calm, looked at his uncle with an expression that had curdled from concern into something rawer and uglier. "You want to know why I did it?" Marcus said, his voice low and shaking. 15 years, Uncle Nathaniel. 15 years I ran the numbers, closed the deals, put in 80-hour weeks while you took Eleanor on anniversary trips to Tuscany and gave interviews about legacy and family values. And every single year the board reminded me that the company would pass to whoever you chose, not whoever earned it. My father was your brother. He built half of this company with you in that first warehouse in 1994, and when he died, you cut his family out of the succession plan entirely. I am not the villain here. I am the son who was promised something and watched it disappear. Nathaniel stood very still, absorbing this, because buried inside his nephew's furious accusation was a grain of truth that he had never fully faced. His brother David had indeed been a founding partner of Coleridge Industries, and when David died in a car accident 22 years earlier, Nathaniel, still raw with his own grief and terrified of losing control of a company he'd sacrificed everything to build, had quietly restructured the ownership shares to consolidate control under himself alone, leaving David's widow and young son with a modest settlement instead of the equity stake that had originally been promised. I was wrong to do that, Nathaniel said quietly, and Marcus, expecting a defense, looked genuinely thrown by the admission. I was grieving and scared, and I made a decision that protected the company at the expense of your mother and you. That was unfair, Marcus, and I should have corrected it years ago, but stealing $42 million and trying to have me declared incompetent is not justice for that wrong. It's just a different kind of theft, wearing better clothes. Marcus's jaw tightened, torn visibly between the anger he'd nursed for 15 years and the uncomfortable truth in his uncle's words. And before he could respond, Preston Hale appeared at the end of the hallway, ashen-faced, phone in hand. "Marcus," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "The Cayman account. Someone accessed it an hour ago and moved everything into an untraceable secondary transfer. It wasn't us." Marcus's face drained of color entirely. What do you mean it wasn't us? That's my account. Preston shook his head. It was your account. Now it's empty, and there's a digital signature attached to the withdrawal that isn't yours. Inside the courtroom, Judge Vasquez reconvened the hearing, and Corinne Ashby rose once more, this time with an expression that told Nathaniel something significant had just happened while they'd been in the hallway. Your Honor, in light of the financial irregularities just discovered, and further evidence obtained within the last hour showing the emptying of the shell account in question, the defense requests that this competency hearing be suspended, pending a full financial fraud investigation into the petitioner's conduct. Judge Vasquez studied the courtroom for a long moment, taking in Marcus's stricken face, Preston's barely concealed panic, and Nathaniel Cole standing tall and steady beside a Tennessee waitress who had just delivered the most compelling testimony of the entire proceeding. This court finds insufficient evidence to support a finding of incompetency, she said finally, her voice carrying clearly through the silent room. Furthermore, given the financial evidence submitted today, I am referring this matter to the Fulton County District Attorney's Office for a full investigation into potential embezzlement and fraud. This hearing is adjourned. The gallery erupted into murmurs and the scraping of chairs, reporters already typing furiously on their phones, and Marcus Cole stood frozen at the petitioner's table, watching 15 years of carefully constructed resentment collapse into public disgrace in the span of a single afternoon. But as security began moving toward him to escort him from the building pending the DA's investigation, Marcus turned back toward his uncle one final time, and what he said next would reveal a secret far older and far more dangerous than embezzled money. "You want to know who really emptied that account?" he called out across the courtroom, loud enough that every reporter in the gallery lifted their phone to record. "Ask your dead brother's other son. Ask about the child David had before he married my mother. Ask why there's a second Cole heir out there who spent the last year quietly buying up shares of this company under a name none of us recognized, until today." The courtroom went utterly silent, and Nathaniel Cole felt the floor of his entire understanding of his own family shift beneath him for the second time in 1 week. Nathaniel returned to Atlanta headquarters that evening, not as a man restored to full control after a legal victory, but as a man reeling from a revelation he could not yet process, and he spent the following 2 days with Diane Marsh, combing through decades of personnel and legal records, trying to trace the shape of the secret his brother had apparently carried to his grave. What they found, buried in a sealed adoption record from 1998 that had been quietly unsealed by court order at some point in the last year, was a name Nathaniel had never heard before. Caleb Reyes, born in Savannah, Georgia, in 1997, to a young woman named Isabel Reyes, who had briefly dated David Cole before David's marriage to Marcus's mother, a relationship that had ended, according to the sparse records, before Isabel discovered she was pregnant, and before David ever knew a child existed at all. Caleb Reyes, now 28 years old, had grown up in foster care after his mother's early death, had put himself through community college working construction, and had, over the past 18 months, quietly and legally acquired a 9% stake in Coleridge Industries through an obscure secondary market broker, using an inheritance from a grandmother he'd never known, money that had apparently been sitting untouched in a trust for years, waiting for him to discover his true parentage. Diane, running the numbers with growing astonishment, realized that the digital signature that had emptied Marcus's Cayman Shell account matched a login credential belonging to an account under the name C. Reyes, meaning that this unknown nephew, this stranger with cold blood in his veins that none of them had known about, had somehow discovered Marcus's fraud independently and drained the stolen funds before Marcus could hide them, an act that was either brilliant vigilante justice or an entirely separate crime, depending on how you looked at it. "He needs to be found," Nathaniel said quietly, staring at a grainy photograph pulled from an old community college newsletter, a young man with his brother David's exact jawline and dark, serious eyes. Before the DA's investigation finds him first and decides he's just another criminal in this mess, instead of what he actually is. What Nathaniel did not say out loud, but what Diane could see plainly written across his exhausted face, was that somewhere in Georgia there was a piece of his brother still walking around in the world, a grandnephew he'd never met, a boy who had grown up in foster care while the Cole family fortune sat untouched a few hundred miles away. And Nathaniel felt the full, crushing weight of exactly how much damage his 15-year-old decision to cut David's family out of the succession plan had truly caused. Grace, who had stayed in Atlanta at Nathaniel's request while the investigation unfolded, watched him wrestle with this discovery from the guest suite of his penthouse, a place so opulent it had taken Tommy, joining them for the weekend, a full 10 minutes of wide-eyed silence before he found his voice again. "You're doing the thing again," Grace said one evening, finding Nathaniel standing alone on the balcony, overlooking the Atlanta skyline, the same skyline Marcus had once stood before, dreaming of everything he thought he was owed. The thing where you disappear inside your own head, instead of talking to the people who actually care about you. Nathaniel turned to her, and in the city lights, she could see how much the past week had aged him, how the confident billionaire from the courtroom had given way again to the uncertain, searching man from the diner. "I built an empire and lost my brother's family in the process," he said quietly. "I promised Eleanor I'd find out if I was still a good man, and instead I'm finding out how many people I hurt along the way, without ever meaning to." Grace crossed the balcony and took his hand, the same gesture she'd offered him in the hospital corridor days earlier, when he'd been nothing more to her than a mysterious ranch hand with secrets. "Being a good man doesn't mean you never made mistakes," she said. "It means what you do when you finally see them clearly. You have a chance right now that most people never get. You can find this boy, this Caleb, and you can actually fix what got broken, instead of just feeling guilty about it in a penthouse. Guilt doesn't build anything, Nathaniel. Action does." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment, this woman who had walked into his manufactured week of poverty with nothing but honesty, and had somehow ended up being the only person willing to tell him hard truths without flattery or fear, and he understood, with sudden and complete clarity, that whatever happened with the company, whatever happened with Marcus or Caleb or the 15 years of buried family wounds, he did not want to walk through the rest of his life without this woman beside him. They found Caleb Reyes 3 days later, working a construction shift on a housing development on the outskirts of Savannah, a tall, quiet young man with careful eyes who went very still when a black car pulled up to the site, and a silver-haired woman in an expensive suit asked if she could speak with him about Coleridge Industries. Caleb's first instinct, born from a childhood of being disappointed by adults who claimed to want to help him, was to refuse and walk away. But when Nathaniel himself stepped out of the car, looking nothing like the tabloid photos Caleb had once searched for, out of aching curiosity, tired and plainly dressed, and clearly nervous, something in Caleb's guarded posture shifted just slightly. "I know this is strange," Nathaniel said, standing awkwardly in a half-finished driveway with concrete dust settling on his expensive shoes. "I found out 4 days ago that you exist. I found out my brother, your father, never knew about you at all, and that you grew up without any of the support this family could have given you, because I made a decision 15 years ago that cut your side of the family out entirely, not even knowing your side existed. I don't expect you to forgive any of that. I'm not even sure I fully understand it myself yet. But I wanted to meet you, and I wanted you to know that whatever happens with the company, whatever the investigation into Marcus turns up, you're not some outside claimant trying to steal something. You're David's son. You're my blood. And you deserved better than what this family gave you." Caleb studied him for a long moment, the silence stretching uncomfortably across the dusty construction site, and then he said something that Nathaniel would remember for the rest of his life. "I didn't buy those shares for money," Caleb said quietly. "I bought them because I wanted to understand the family that never knew I existed. I wanted to see, up close, whether the people who share my blood were worth being angry at, or worth trying to know. I saw Marcus moving money into that Cayman account last month. During a shareholder disclosure review, I requested access to as a minority stakeholder. I didn't plan on emptying it. I just couldn't stand watching him steal from a company my father helped build, while I was still deciding whether any of you were even worth caring about." Over the following days, as the Fulton County District Attorney's Office built its case against Marcus Cole for embezzlement, wire fraud, and attempted financial exploitation of an elder, charges that would eventually result in a plea agreement, 5 years in federal prison, and full restitution of the $42 million Caleb had already secured and voluntarily returned, Nathaniel Cole did something none of his board, his lawyers, or even Diane expected. He called an emergency shareholder meeting and voluntarily restructured the company's ownership, formally recognizing Caleb Reyes as a full family shareholder with the equity stake that should have passed to David's side of the family 22 years earlier, an act that made headlines across the country not because it was legally required, but precisely because it wasn't. 6 months later, on a warm Saturday afternoon in early spring, the Whitfield Ranch looked different than it had the stormy night Nathaniel Cole first stumbled through its gate, soaked and desperate and pretending to be poor. The property tax debt had been paid in full, quietly, the same week as Tommy's hospital bill, though Grace had insisted on treating it as a loan she was slowly repaying rather than a gift, because pride, as it turned out, was not something $11 billion could simply erase, nor did Nathaniel want it to. New fencing stretched clean and white across the pasture. A fresh coat of paint brightened the farmhouse, and Tommy, now 7 and glowing with health after months of successful treatment, chased a very patient golden retriever across the yard while a small crowd of family and friends gathered under a string of lights for an occasion that had once seemed impossible to everyone involved. Ruth Whitfield stood on the porch in her Sunday best, shotgun nowhere in sight for the first time in recent memory, watching her granddaughter walk down a simple aisle of hay bales and wildflowers toward a man who had once mucked out her barn for a meal and a place to sleep, and who was now, unbelievably, marrying into a family that had learned, the hard way, exactly what real wealth was supposed to look like. Caleb Reyes stood among the guests, no longer a stranger but a genuine cousin to Tommy and a steady, growing presence in the family. Nathaniel was determined to finally get right, and beside him sat Diane Marsh, who had stayed on not just as an executive assistant, but as something closer to family herself, having witnessed the entire transformation from the very first frantic phone call in the rain. As Nathaniel Cole took Grace Whitfield's hands beneath a sky turning gold with sunset, surrounded by the people who had taught him, in a single desperate week, more about being a good man than 30 years of boardrooms and business deals ever had, he found himself thinking about Eleanor, about the promise he'd made her in that hospital room 6 months before all of this began. He had gone looking for one person who would be kind to a stranger for no reason at all, and he had found not just one person, but an entire family willing to open their door, their table, and eventually their hearts to a man who had nothing to offer them but honesty. And in return, he had learned that the truest wealth a person could ever hold was never measured in the accounts he controlled, but in the people who would still choose to stand beside him, even after they knew exactly who he really was. If this story moved you even a little, that is exactly why we tell them. Because somewhere out there tonight, someone needs to be reminded that kindness offered without expectation has a way of finding its way back, sometimes in ways too big to ever imagine. If you felt that tonight, let us know in the comments what part of Grace and Nathaniel's story stayed with you the longest. Give this video a like so more people can find it, and subscribe for more stories about ordinary people whose quiet decency changes everything around them. Because the truth is, you never really know whose life you might be changing when you choose, even for a stranger, even when it costs you something, to simply be kind.